The emergency beacon from Ember 7 had been silent for 3 days when Captain Daeho brought his ship out of faster-than-light travel. The UES Steadfast emerged into normal space near the small moon, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The mining colony's lights were dark. No ships moved in orbit. No communications answered his hails. Daeho had been a naval officer for 20 years. He had seen accidents, equipment failures, and natural disasters. But something about this silence felt wrong. He ordered his crew to battle stations as they approached the moon's surface. The colony had been home to 3,000 people. Miners, engineers, teachers, doctors, and families who had come to Ember 7 seeking a better life. The moon was rich in rare metals that humanity needed for their growing fleet of starships. It was a peaceful place far from any conflict or danger, or so everyone had thought. When the landing team touched down, they found hell waiting for them. The main habitat dome had been breached in dozens of places. Buildings were burned. Streets were covered in debris and blood. Bodies lay everywhere, frozen in the moon's thin atmosphere. Men, women, children. None had been spared. Daeho walked through the ruins with his security team. He had fought in border skirmishes during humanity's expansion into space. He had seen combat deaths before. But this was different. This was not war. This was slaughter. The colonists had been unarmed civilians. They had no military defenses, no reason to expect an attack. Someone had come here specifically to kill them all. In the colony's medical center, they found her, a young woman named Bora, barely alive, trapped under fallen debris. She had survived by hiding in a storage room when the attack began. The medical team rushed her back to the ship and put her in emergency care. For 2 days, she was unconscious, her body struggling to recover from exposure and injuries. When Bora finally woke, Daeho was there. She told him everything through tears and shaking hands. Ships had arrived without warning, large warships with weapons that tore through the colony's simple defenses like paper. The attackers had not tried to communicate or make demands. They simply started killing. Bora had seen soldiers in dark armor moving through the streets, shooting anyone they found. She had watched her family die before she managed to hide. The soldiers had spoken a language she did not know, but she had seen their ships up close. The design matched vessels from the Vexil Dominion, a powerful empire that controlled hundreds of star systems. The Vexil were technically members of the Galactic Council, the organization that was supposed to maintain peace among all spacefaring species. But everyone knew the Vexil bent the rules. They used legal tricks and unofficial forces to expand their territory and bully weaker species. Daeho sent his report to Earth immediately. He included everything: the evidence of Vexil weapons, recordings from the colony's damaged security systems, and Bora's testimony. He also sent his own recommendation. This was not an accident or a random attack. This was a deliberate massacre, and someone needed to answer for it. On Earth, Admiral Hyun-sik received the report in his office at United Earth Forces headquarters. He was an old man now, with gray hair and a face marked by decades of hard decisions. He had helped build humanity's navy from nothing, guiding Earth through its first contact with alien species and its entry into the Galactic Council. He had always counseled caution, patience, and diplomacy. But as he watched the recordings from Ember 7, something changed in his eyes. He called Ambassador Jiwoo to his office. She was younger, idealistic, and believed deeply in the Galactic Council's mission. She had spent years building relationships with other species, learning their cultures and promoting understanding. When she saw the evidence from Ember 7, she was horrified but not paralyzed. She immediately began preparing a formal complaint to present to the Council. Jiwoo traveled to the Council's massive station that orbited a neutral star system. The station was a wonder of engineering, home to representatives from 847 different species. She had always found it inspiring, a symbol of what different peoples could accomplish when they worked together. Now, as she entered the council chamber, she felt only grim determination. She presented her case with careful precision. She showed the evidence, played the recordings, and made a clear accusation. The Vexil Dominion, through its military forces, had committed mass murder against human civilians. She demanded an immediate investigation, sanctions against the Vexil, and justice for the victims. The council chamber filled with the sounds of translation devices and whispered conversations. Representatives from hundreds of species discussed the accusation among themselves. Finally, Warlord Throck, the Vexil representative, stood to respond. He was massive even for his species, with dark scales and cold eyes that showed no emotion. Throck's response was smooth and prepared. He expressed sympathy for the human losses. He condemned the attack as a tragedy, but he denied any official Vexual involvement. The ships, he claimed, must have been stolen or operated by criminals. The Vexil Dominion could not be held responsible for the actions of raiders who happened to use similar equipment. He suggested that the humans had perhaps made enemies during their expansion into that region of space. Jiwoo felt anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. She pointed out that the attack had been too organized, too professional to be random raiders. She noted that the Vexil had been expanding toward Ember 7's region for years. She demanded a proper investigation with full access to Vexil military records. The council began its debate. Representatives stood one by one to give their opinions. Some expressed support for humanity's demand for justice. Others counseled patience and careful examination of all evidence. Many seemed more concerned with maintaining the appearance of peace than with addressing the actual crime. After hours of discussion, the council voted. They would form an investigative committee to examine the evidence and determine responsibility. The committee would have representatives from multiple species to ensure fairness. They would submit their findings and recommendations to the full council for action. Ambassador Jiwoo asked how long this would take. The council chairman, a being that looked like a floating crystal cluster, stated that thorough investigation required time. They estimated the process would take approximately 4 standard years to complete. 4 years. The killers would walk free for 4 years while bureaucrats debated and studied and wrote reports. Jiwoo felt something break inside her faith in the council system. She had believed in this organization, trusted in its principles and procedures. But now she saw it for what it truly was. A system designed by species who had forgotten what real conflict meant, who valued process over justice, and who would sacrifice the weak to avoid confronting the strong. She returned to Earth with the council's decision. Admiral Hyunsik was not surprised. He had expected exactly this outcome. He called an emergency meeting of the United Earth Assembly, the governing body that represented all of humanity's colonies and settlements. The assembly met in the Great Hall in Geneva. Representatives from Mars, Luna, Titan, and hundreds of colony worlds gathered in person or via hologram. Admiral Hyunsik stood before them and presented the evidence from Ember 7. He showed them the bodies of their people. He played Bora's testimony. He read the council's decision to wait 4 years before taking any action. Then he made his recommendation. Humanity could not wait for a bureaucratic investigation, while their people's murderers remained unpunished. Humanity could not trust a system that valued procedure over justice. Humanity stood alone, but humanity would stand strong. He proposed a formal declaration of war against the Vexil Dominion. The assembly chamber erupted in shouting and argument. Some representatives were horrified, warning that humanity could not possibly win a war against such a powerful enemy. Others demanded action, refusing to accept that their people could be slaughtered without response. The debate raged for hours. Finally, the vote was called. When the results appeared on the main screen, the chamber fell silent. By a margin of 68%, the United Earth Assembly had voted yes. Admiral Hyunsik addressed the entire human species in a broadcast that reached every colony, every ship, and every settlement. He spoke simply and clearly. He explained what had happened at Ember 7. He explained the Council's failure to provide justice, and he announced that Earth would not wait any longer. Humanity declared war on the Vexil Dominion. The broadcast was picked up by monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. Within hours, every species in the Galactic Council knew what humanity had done. Shock and disbelief spread through the civilized galaxy. No species had unilaterally declared war in over 3,000 years. The very concept was alien to modern galactic society. But humanity remembered war. Humanity had never forgotten. And now the galaxy would learn what that meant. The news of humanity's declaration of war spread through the Galactic Council like a shockwave. In the great station where representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered, chaos erupted. Species who had lived in peace for thousands of years suddenly faced something they had only read about in ancient history. An actual war between spacefaring civilizations. Chancellor Nari stood before the Council Assembly the day after the declaration. She was humanity's chief representative, a diplomat who had spent years building bridges between Earth and other species. Now those bridges were burning. The other representatives looked at her with a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. How could humanity be so reckless? How could they endanger galactic peace over a single incident? The council chairman demanded that Earth rescind its declaration immediately. Nari refused. The chairman warned that humanity would face sanctions, trade embargoes, and isolation. Nari replied that humanity was prepared to stand alone if necessary. Her people would not abandon justice for the sake of convenience. The council voted to expel Earth's delegation from the chamber. Nari gathered her staff and left without protest. As she walked through the station's corridors, she could feel the stares from alien beings who had once called her a friend. Now they saw her as a warmonger, a dangerous barbarian who threatened their peaceful existence. But Nari knew something they did not. She had seen the files from Ember 7. She had read the reports that intelligence services had compiled about the Vexil Dominion. The Vexil had committed atrocities on dozens of worlds over the past century. They had simply been careful to target species too weak to fight back, and the Council had been too comfortable to intervene. Humanity was not starting a war. Humanity was finally responding to one that had been going on for years. On Earth, the preparation for war began immediately. Commander Tae-yang stood in the orbital shipyard above Mars and watched as thousands of workers swarmed over the construction frames. He had been given an impossible task: multiply Earth's naval capacity by 10 within a single year. The military advisors said it could not be done. Tae-yang replied that it would be done because it had to be. Humanity's approach to shipbuilding was different from other species. The aliens built elegant vessels that took years to construct, each one a unique masterpiece of engineering. Humans built practical ships that could be assembled in months using modular components. Where other species valued artistry, humans valued efficiency. Where other species built for prestige, humans built for war. The shipyards worked around the clock. New facilities were constructed on Luna, Titan, and in the asteroid belt. Mining operations accelerated to provide raw materials. Every industrial capacity that humanity possessed was redirected toward a single purpose: building a fleet that could fight the Vexil and win. Commander Tae-yang worked 18-hour days, coordinating construction schedules, resolving supply chain problems, and pushing his teams to work faster. He knew that every day of delay could mean more human deaths when the Vexil responded to the declaration. Speed was as important as numbers. In a classified research facility beneath the surface of Luna, Dr. Youngjia led a team of military strategists and historians. She had been given access to every piece of information humanity had ever recorded about warfare. Ancient battles, modern conflicts, strategic theories, tactical innovations. Her task was to find advantages that humanity could use against a more powerful enemy. The Galactic Council species had lived in peace for 3,000 years. They had forgotten how to fight. Their military doctrines were outdated, designed for ceremonial displays and border patrols rather than actual combat. They followed rules of engagement that treated war like a sport, with agreed-upon limitations and expectations of civilized behavior. Dr. Youngjia knew that humanity could not afford such luxuries. She developed a new military doctrine based on Earth's long history of warfare. Humans would not fight fair. They would use deception, guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and overwhelming force. They would target supply lines and communications. They would make the Vexil afraid to leave their heavily defended systems. The doctrine was brutal and efficient. Some of the review committee members were uncomfortable with the methods. Dr. Youngjia reminded them that 3,000 civilians had died on Ember 7. This was not a time for moral hesitation. This was a time for victory. Lieutenant Su Min sat in the cockpit of her fighter craft, running through simulation after simulation. She was part of the new fighter wing being trained in humanity's revolutionary approach to space combat. Other species used fighters as scouts or for ceremonial escort duties. Humans planned to use them as weapons. The doctrine called for swarm tactics, hundreds of small, fast fighters attacking from multiple directions, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer numbers. The fighters would use asteroids and debris for cover, something other species considered dishonorable. They would employ hit-and-run attacks, never engaging in the formal ship-to-ship duels that galactic warfare traditionally required. Su-min loved it. She had trained for years in the old style, learning to pilot by the book. Now she was learning to improvise, to think like a predator rather than a chess player. Her instructors encouraged creativity and aggression. In simulations, she learned to use every dirty trick she could imagine. Nothing was off limits if it gave her an advantage. The training was intense. Half her class washed out in the first month, but those who remained became something new. Fighter pilots who could think and act in ways no alien pilot could predict. While humanity prepared, the Vexel Dominion watched with amusement. Warlord Throck reviewed the intelligence reports about Earth's military buildup and laughed. The humans were building ships as fast as they could, but they only had a few hundred vessels. The Vexel fleet numbered in the tens of thousands. This war would be over in a matter of weeks. Throck decided to teach humanity a lesson they would never forget. He assembled a punishment fleet of 800 ships and gave them a simple order. Go to Earth and force humanity's unconditional surrender. Kill as many as necessary to make the point clear. Humanity would learn that challenging the Vexel Dominion was a fatal mistake. The Vexel fleet entered human space with confidence. They expected to find a desperate, frightened enemy trying to defend their homeworld. Instead, they found something they had not anticipated. Admiral Hunsik had prepared a defensive perimeter in the outer solar system. He had positioned his ships among the moons and debris of the Kuiper Belt, using the natural cover to hide his forces. He had deployed thousands of automated defense platforms, each one armed with weapons designed specifically to destroy Vexel ships. And he had waited. When the Vexel fleet reached Neptune's orbit, they walked into a trap. The battle that followed would later be called the Battle of Neptune's Shadow, and it changed everything. The Vexel expected a straightforward engagement. They formed their traditional battle lines and prepared to advance. Then the humans opened fire from multiple directions at once. Missiles launched from hidden platforms. Railguns fired from unexpected angles. Fighter wings swarmed out of asteroid cover and attacked the Vexel flanks. The Vexel fleet was larger and more powerful, but they fought according to ancient rules that no longer applied. They expected honor and ceremony. The humans gave them chaos and violence. Lieutenant Su-min led her fighter squadron in a suicidal charge through the Vexel formation. Half her pilots were killed in the first pass, but they destroyed 3 capital ships by targeting their exposed reactor systems. Other fighter wings copied her tactics, trading their lives for maximum damage. Commander Taeyang watched from the command ship as his new vessels engaged the enemy. The human ships were smaller and weaker individually, but they worked together with practiced coordination. They used pack tactics, concentrating fire on single targets until they were destroyed, then moving to the next victim. Dr. Youngja's doctrine was put to the test. Humans used nuclear weapons, kinetic impactors, and directed energy weapons without hesitation. They targeted life support systems and command centers. They did not try to disable enemy ships for capture. They simply killed them as efficiently as possible. The battle lasted 47 hours. When it was over, the Vexel fleet had been destroyed. 800 ships had entered the solar system. Less than 300 escaped. The humans had lost 70 ships and thousands of lives, but they had won. The recordings of the battle were transmitted across the galaxy. Species who had dismissed humanity as weak barbarians watched in shock as human forces tore apart a fleet that should have crushed them. The Vexel, who had been considered one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, had been defeated by a species that had only joined the galactic community 2 decades earlier. Warlord Throck received the news in his fortress on the Vexel homeworld. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had never experienced before: fear. These humans were not civilized. They were predators, and they were coming for him. Ambassador Jiwoo watched the battle recordings from her exile on an independent trading station. She felt sick at the violence, at the loss of life on both sides. But she also felt a grim satisfaction. The Galactic Council had failed to provide justice. Now humanity would provide it themselves. Admiral Hunsik did not celebrate the victory at Neptune. While other commanders were congratulating themselves on defeating the Vexel punishment fleet, he was already planning the next move. Defense was not enough. The enemy needed to understand that attacking humanity came with a terrible price. He launched Operation Reckoning 3 days after the battle. It was a massive counteroffensive that would take the war directly into Vexul territory. The plan was aggressive and risky, but Hunsik knew that humanity could not win through caution. They needed to strike hard and fast before the Vexul could organize a proper response. Captain Deho commanded one of the battle groups assigned to the operation. He had been promoted after his actions at Ember 7, and now he led 15 ships deep into enemy space. His orders were simple: destroy everything of military value. Supply depots, communication stations, shipyards, and garrison bases. Leave nothing that could support the Vexul war effort. Deho followed his orders with cold efficiency. His battle group hit 3 supply stations in the first week. The attacks were brutal and precise. Human ships emerged from faster-than-light travel at close range, fired everything they had, and jumped away before the defenders could organize a response. The Vexul had never faced such tactics. They were accustomed to formal challenges and predetermined battlefields. The humans gave them terror and confusion. At the 4th target, Deho's force encountered civilians. The space station they attacked was primarily a supply hub, but it also housed thousands of Vexul workers and their families. His weapons officer asked if they should avoid civilian casualties. Deho remembered Ember 7. He remembered 3,000 dead humans who had been civilians too. He gave the order to fire. The station was destroyed. Intelligence estimates suggested that 5,000 Vexul died in the attack. Deho felt nothing. He had learned that war was not about feeling. It was about winning. Across Vexul space, other human battle groups conducted similar operations. They hit targets throughout the Dominion's territory, never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to concentrate forces against them. The Vexul military tried to adapt, but their entire strategic doctrine was built around fighting large fleet battles in predetermined locations. The humans refused to cooperate. Specialist Yunji worked in intelligence operations, coordinating information warfare against the Vexul. She had studied computer science before the war, and had been recruited by military intelligence for her hacking skills. Now she led a team that infiltrated Vexul communication networks and spread chaos. They launched cyber attacks that shut down navigation systems and corrupted supply databases. They inserted false information into military communications, sending Vexul forces to defend locations that were not under attack. They broadcast propaganda directly to Vexul citizens, showing them the casualties their military was suffering, and questioning why they were fighting humanity at all. The Vexul had sophisticated technology, but they had never faced an enemy who used information as a weapon. Their security systems were designed to prevent unauthorized access, not to defend against coordinated psychological warfare. Junji and her team exploited every weakness they found. One of her most effective operations involved hacking into the Vexul military's internal communication system and broadcasting footage from human attacks. Vexul soldiers watched as their bases were destroyed, their supply lines cut, and their fleets scattered. The footage was edited to make human forces seem larger and more powerful than they actually were. Fear spread through the Vexul ranks faster than any weapon could. The Galactic Council watched the war with growing alarm. Emergency sessions were held almost daily as representatives debated what to do about the conflict. Some species called for intervention, arguing that humanity's methods were barbaric and violated every principle of civilized warfare. Others pointed out that the Vexul had started the conflict by massacring civilians, and that humanity was simply responding in kind. A faction led by the Tarathi Republic began quietly supporting the human war effort. The Tarathi were a peaceful species who had suffered under Vexul aggression for decades, but had been too weak to resist. They provided intelligence about Vexul military positions and allowed human ships to use their space for transit. They did this secretly, knowing that open support would make them targets. Ambassador Jiwoo worked from an independent station, conducting diplomacy outside official channels. She had been expelled from the council, but many representatives still respected her and were willing to meet privately. She used these meetings to share evidence of Vexul atrocities that the council had ignored for years. She showed them records of attacks on weak species, of colonies destroyed, of populations enslaved. The Vexul had committed crimes across dozens of worlds, always careful to target those who could not fight back. The Council had known about these crimes but had done nothing because confronting the Vexel would have been difficult and uncomfortable. Jiwoo's evidence created a split in the Council. Some species began to publicly question whether the Vexel deserved protection under galactic law. Others argued that regardless of past crimes, the current war threatened the stability that had kept the galaxy peaceful for millennia. The debate became heated and bitter. Warlord Throck watched his empire crumble. The humans were hitting targets faster than he could defend them. His fleets were scattered across hundreds of systems, trying to protect everything and succeeding at protecting nothing. His commanders begged for a chance to engage the human forces in a proper battle, but the humans refused to cooperate. In desperation, Throck authorized the use of forbidden weapons. The Galactic Council had banned biological weapons designed to target specific species after ancient wars had nearly destroyed entire civilizations. But Throck was losing his war and his power. He ordered his scientists to deploy a bioweapon against humanity. The attack came at New Busan, a colony world with a population of 300,000. Vexel agents released the bioweapon into the planet's atmosphere. It was designed to target human physiology specifically, causing a disease that killed slowly and painfully. The first cases appeared within days. Then hundreds, then thousands. The colony's medical facilities were overwhelmed. People died in their homes, in hospitals, in the streets. The human authorities tried to organize evacuations, but the bioweapon spread faster than they could respond. Dr. Youngjia was called in to analyze the disease. She worked in a sealed laboratory on Luna, studying samples brought from New Busan. What she found horrified her. The bioweapon was sophisticated and precise. It had been engineered specifically to kill humans while leaving other species untouched. This was not a weapon of war. This was a weapon of genocide. She immediately broadcast her findings to the entire galaxy. The evidence was undeniable. The Vexel had violated one of the most fundamental laws of galactic civilization. They had used a weapon designed to exterminate an entire species. The reaction was explosive. Species who had remained neutral suddenly called for action against the Vexel. The use of bioweapons crossed a line that even the most cautious civilizations could not ignore. The Galactic Council held an emergency session to address the crisis, but instead of condemning the Vexel, the Council attempted to impose a ceasefire on both sides. They called for all military operations to halt immediately while they investigated the bioweapon attack. They suggested that a negotiated peace was the only way to prevent further escalation. Chancellor Nari was invited to address the council. She stood before the assembled representatives and spoke clearly. Humanity would not accept a ceasefire. The Vexel had murdered 3,000 civilians at Ember 7 without provocation. They had now murdered 60,000 more with illegal bioweapons. Humanity would not stop fighting until justice was served. The council warned that continued war would result in sanctions against Earth. Nari replied that humanity did not care about sanctions. They cared about ensuring that their people's killers faced consequences. If the council would not provide justice, humanity would take it themselves. She left the council chamber to a chorus of protests and arguments. The galaxy was splitting into factions. Some supported humanity's right to seek justice. Others feared that allowing this war to continue would destroy the peaceful order that had existed for thousands of years. Admiral Hyun-sik intensified the offensive. More battle groups were deployed into Vexel space. More targets were hit. The Vexel military was collapsing under the sustained assault. Their economy was failing as supply lines were cut. Their client species were beginning to rebel, seeing weakness where they had once seen strength. Captain Daeho led his battle group to the Vexel colony of Tharkos Prime. It was a major industrial center, producing ships and weapons for the Dominion's military. Intelligence reported that the orbital shipyards were critical to the Vexel war effort. Destroying them would cripple the enemy's ability to replace losses. The battle for Tharkos Prime lasted 3 days. The Vexel defenders fought desperately, knowing how important the shipyards were. But human tactics were too effective. Daeho's ships used the planet's moon for cover, launching hit-and-run attacks that the defenders could not counter. Fighter wings led by pilots trained in Lieutenant Suman's aggressive style overwhelmed the Vexel patrols. The war had been going on for 14 months when Earth announced total mobilization. Every resource, every factory, every mind capable of contributing to the war effort was redirected toward a single goal: complete victory over the Vexel Dominion. The time for limited warfare was over. Commander Tai Yang stood in the expanded shipyards above Mars and marveled at what humanity had accomplished. Where there had been dozens of construction frames, there were now hundreds. Where there had been thousands of workers, there were now millions. The industrial capacity of human civilization had been transformed into a vast war machine. But the cost was visible everywhere. Consumer goods were rationed. Luxury items disappeared from markets. Every civilian ship had been converted to military use or scrapped for materials. People worked longer hours for less pay. Schools taught children engineering and logistics instead of art and music. Humanity was sacrificing everything for victory. Tai Yang had stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. There was always another problem to solve, another bottleneck to clear, another deadline to meet. He had lost weight and his hair had started going gray. He was only 35 years old but looked 50. He did not care. The work was too important. Bora had not returned to colony life after Ember 7th. Instead, she had joined the war effort as an engineer. Her personal experience with Vexel brutality gave her a cold focus that impressed her superiors. She rose quickly through the ranks, and now she led the design team for a new class of warship. The Vengeance-class dreadnought was unlike anything humanity had built before. It was massive, powered by antimatter reactors that pushed the limits of human technology. It carried weapons that violated 3 different Galactic Council treaties. Particle beam cannons that could burn through shields in seconds, missile pods that could launch hundreds of warheads simultaneously, and experimental directed energy weapons that could disable entire fleets. Bora designed the ship with one purpose: to make the Vexel pay for what they had done. She did not care about galactic law or diplomatic consequences. She cared about building the most destructive weapon possible. When colleagues expressed concern about the ethical implications, she would show them pictures from Ember 7. The conversation always ended there. The first Vengeance-class ship was completed in 8 months. It should have taken years, but humanity was working at a pace that seemed impossible to other species. They were motivated by something the galaxy had forgotten: righteous anger and the will to use it. Admiral Hyun-sik inspected the first dreadnought personally. He walked through its massive corridors and looked at its weapon systems. He felt a moment of doubt. This ship was designed to kill on a scale that seemed almost evil. But then he thought about the children who had died at Ember 7th, and about the 60,000 who had been murdered by bioweapons at New Busan. His doubt vanished. He ordered the construction of 30 more Vengeance-class dreadnoughts. The shipyards worked around the clock. Within 8 months, all 30 were complete. It was an achievement that defied every projection and estimate. Humanity had accomplished in months what should have taken decades. The final offensive was planned with meticulous care. Admiral Hyun-sik gathered his fleet at a staging area in neutral space. Over 1,000 ships, including the 30 new dreadnoughts. It was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. And it was all pointed at one target: the Vexel homeworld. Captain Daeho commanded a battle group within the main fleet. He had fought in every major engagement of the war. He had seen friends die, had given orders that resulted in thousands of deaths, and had watched his own humanity slowly erode under the weight of constant violence. But he had never questioned the necessity of what they were doing. The Vexel had started this war. Humanity would finish it. The fleet jumped into Vexel space in a massive coordinated assault. Warlord Thrak had prepared his defense well. Every ship the Vexel could still field was positioned to protect their homeworld. Orbital defense platforms ringed the planet. Thousands of automated weapons covered every approach. It was the strongest defensive position in the entire Dominion. The battle was apocalyptic. Human ships crashed into the Vexel defenses like a hammer striking an anvil. Both sides fought with desperate intensity. The Vexel were defending their homes and families. The humans were seeking final justice for their dead. Lieutenant Su-min led her fighter wing into the heart of the battle. She had survived every engagement so far through a combination of skill and luck. She knew her luck was running out. The defensive fire was too intense, the enemy fighters too numerous. But she had a mission: destroy the orbital defense platform so the capital ships could advance. Her wing dove through a debris field so dense that her navigation computer shut down. She flew by instinct and training, dodging wreckage and enemy fire. 3 of her pilots died in the first minute, 5 more in the second, but the survivors pressed on. They reached the defense platform and unleashed everything they had. Missiles, railgun fire, even ramming attacks when ammunition ran out. Su-min watched her wingmate deliberately crash his damaged fighter into the platform's reactor. The explosion was visible across half the system. One by one, the defense platforms fell. Su-min lost over half her wing, but they completed their mission. The path was clear for the capital ships. Captain Daeho's battle group pushed through the weakened defenses. His ships took heavy fire from Vexel vessels, desperate to stop the advance. He lost 3 ships in the first hour, but the Vengeance-class dreadnoughts were proving their worth. Their massive weapons tore through Vexel shields and armor like they were made of paper. Daeho watched as one of the dreadnoughts fired its main particle beam cannon. The weapon drew so much power that the surrounding space visibly distorted. When the beam hit a Vexel battleship, the entire vessel simply vaporized. There was no explosion, no debris. One moment the ship existed, the next it was gone. The Vexel defense was collapsing. Their ships were being destroyed faster than they could coordinate a response. The humans had broken through the orbital defenses and were now in position to bombard the planet itself. Admiral Hyun-sik gave the order. The Vengeance-class dreadnoughts opened fire on military targets across the planet's surface. Weapons installations, command centers, military bases. The bombardment was precise but devastating. Cities burned. Infrastructure collapsed. Millions died. Ambassador Jiwoo watched the battle from the observation deck of a neutral station near the Vexual system. She had been invited by species who wanted to document what was happening. They needed to see what humanity was capable of when pushed to total war. She watched as human weapons struck the planet below. Each explosion represented hundreds or thousands of deaths. She felt sick. This was not what she had wanted when she had first presented evidence to the Galactic Council. She had wanted justice through law, not vengeance through violence. But the Council had failed. They had chosen bureaucracy over action, process over justice. And now the galaxy was paying the price for that failure. Humanity had shown what happens when a species that remembers war is forced to use that knowledge. The bombardment continued for 3 days. When it finally stopped, the Vexel military had been destroyed. Their shipyards were rubble. Their command structure was shattered. Warlord Thrak was captured trying to flee the planet in a disguised transport. The war was over. Humanity had won, but the cost had been staggering. Commander Tae Yang reviewed the casualty reports. Over 80,000 human military personnel dead. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lost to Vexel attacks. The economy devastated by total mobilization. It would take generations to recover. Dr. Young Ja compiled statistics on the Vexel losses. Military deaths numbered in the millions. Civilian casualties were hard to estimate, but certainly exceeded 10 million. Entire cities had been destroyed. Their civilization was broken. Chancellor Nari addressed the Galactic Council one final time. She stood before the Assembly, which was now willing to listen after having ignored humanity for so long. She spoke about the price of peace through inaction. She explained how the Council's failure to stop the Vexel decades ago had led directly to this war. She told them that humanity had not wanted this. Humanity had asked for justice through proper channels. When those channels failed, humanity had been forced to take justice into their own hands. And they had shown the galaxy what that meant. The council chamber was silent. Representatives from hundreds of species listened to her words and felt something they had not experienced in thousands of years. Shame. They had failed in their duty to protect the weak. They had allowed predators like the Vexul to operate with impunity. And when victims finally fought back, the council had condemned them for defending themselves. Nari finished her speech with a warning. Humanity had proven that they could fight and win against the galaxy's powerful empires. But they had also proven something more important. They were willing to sacrifice everything for justice. The galaxy needed to remember that lesson. She walked out of the council chamber to absolute silence. Admiral Hyun-sik stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the Vexel homeworld on the view screen. He had achieved his objective. The enemy was defeated. Justice had been served. The trial of Warlord Thrak was held on Earth, not in the Galactic Council chambers. Humanity had made it clear that they would handle justice themselves after the Council's failure to act. Representatives from other species were invited to observe, but they had no voice in the proceedings. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Evidence was presented documenting the massacre at Ember 7th. the use of bioweapons at New Busan, and dozens of other atrocities committed under Throck's command. Witnesses testified about villages burned, families murdered, and populations enslaved. The documentation was thorough and damning. Throck showed no remorse. He sat in the defendant's chair and stared at his accusers with cold eyes. When asked to respond to the charges, he simply stated that he had done what was necessary to expand his empire. Weakness invited aggression. Strength ensured survival. He had been strong and humanity had been weak. That they had somehow won did not change the fundamental truth of the universe. The judges found him guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. Throck was executed 3 days later in a quick and efficient manner. There was no ceremony, no dramatic speech. He was simply removed from existence, just as he had removed thousands of others. The execution was broadcast across the galaxy. Species that had never witnessed capital punishment in their lifetimes watched in shock. But they also understood the message. Humanity would not show mercy to those who committed atrocities against them. The Vexil Dominion collapsed in the aftermath of the war. Without their military strength and with their homeworld devastated, they could no longer hold their empire together. Client species rebelled. Territory was lost. Within a year, what had been one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations had fragmented into dozens of smaller states, each fighting for survival. The Galactic Council faced a crisis of legitimacy. Dozens of species demanded reform, pointing to the Council's failure to prevent the war or protect innocent lives. If the system could not prevent atrocities or provide justice, what was it actually good for? Emergency sessions were held daily. Reformers pushed for changes to how the Council operated. Conservatives argued that the system had worked for thousands of years and should not be altered because of one conflict. The debate became bitter and divided the galaxy into competing factions. On Earth, humanity faced its own difficult questions. Admiral Hyun-sik and the military leadership argued that the war had proven humanity needed to maintain a strong military. They could not trust the galaxy to protect them or provide justice. They needed to be strong enough to defend themselves and strike back against any threat. Ambassador Ji-woo led the opposition. She argued that humanity could not become a perpetual war machine. The cost of total mobilization had been too high. The economy was strained, the population exhausted, and the moral damage from years of violence would take generations to heal. Humanity needed to find a different path forward. Dr. Youngja presented her research to the government. She had studied the war's impact on human civilization. The numbers were stark. Development in science, medicine, and technology had been set back decades as all resources went to military applications. Birth rates had dropped as families delayed having children during the war. Mental health problems were epidemic among those who had served in combat or worked in war industries. The research showed that humanity had won the war, but had damaged itself in the process. If they continued on the military path, they would eventually become like the Vexil, strong but hollow, capable of destruction but unable to create anything of lasting value. The debate raged in the United Earth Assembly. Some representatives argued for maintaining military readiness at all costs. Others pushed for rapid demobilization and return to peaceful development. The vote was close, but eventually a compromise was reached. Humanity would maintain a strong military, but would not let it consume their entire civilization. A new Galactic Assembly was proposed to replace the old council system. The proposal came from an unlikely coalition of species who had watched the war and realized that the galaxy needed fundamental change. The old system had been designed by and for species who had forgotten conflict. The new system needed to account for the reality that injustice could not always be solved through endless debate. Chancellor Nari was invited to help design the new system. She worked with representatives from dozens of species to create something better. The key innovation was the establishment of an enforceable justice system. No longer would the powerful be able to commit atrocities with impunity, while bureaucrats debated for years. There would be actual consequences for violations of galactic law. The proposal also included a collective defense agreement. Species that joined the new assembly would be protected by combined military forces. Any attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. The goal was to prevent future wars by ensuring that aggressors would face overwhelming opposition. Admiral Hyun-sik was asked to lead the military component of the new assembly. He would command a combined defense fleet drawn from multiple species. It was an enormous responsibility, and a sign of how much the galaxy's view of humanity had changed. A year ago, they had been dismissed as dangerous barbarians. Now they were being asked to serve as guardians. Daeho, now promoted to admiral himself, worked with officers from other species to develop the new fleet's doctrine. It was a strange experience teaching aliens how to fight. Most of them had no combat experience and struggled with concepts that seemed obvious to human military minds. But slowly, they learned. The alien officers came to understand that effective military force required more than advanced technology. It required the will to use that force decisively, and the strategic thinking to use it wisely. The humans taught them not just tactics, but the philosophy behind military effectiveness. Lieutenant Su Min became a training instructor for the new Combined Fighter Corps. She taught pilots from a dozen species the aggressive tactics that had proven so effective during the war. It was satisfying work, knowing that she was helping to build a force that could prevent future conflicts. The proposal for the new Galactic Assembly was put to a vote. It required a 2/3 majority to pass. The debate in the old council chamber was intense. Some species feared giving up the comfortable system they had known for millennia. Others recognized that the old system had failed and that change was necessary. When the vote was finally called, the proposal passed with 74% support. The age of the Galactic Council was over. The age of the reformed Galactic Union had begun. 10 years passed. The galaxy slowly recovered from the turmoil of the war. The new system proved more effective than the old. Several potential conflicts were resolved quickly through the Union's justice system before they could escalate to violence. The combined defense fleet successfully deterred aggression from species that might have otherwise tested boundaries. Bora returned to Ember 7 for the first time since the massacre. The colony had been rebuilt, larger and more prosperous than before. A memorial stood in the central plaza, bearing the names of 3,000 dead. She placed flowers at the memorial and allowed herself to cry for the first time in years. She was no longer just an engineer. She served as Earth's Minister of Colonial Defense, ensuring that no human settlement would ever again stand undefended. Every colony now had military protection and early warning systems. The lesson of Ember 7 had been learned and would not be forgotten. Commander Taeyang, now retired from military service, had returned to civilian industry. He helped rebuild Earth's economic capacity, converting war production back to peaceful purposes. It was slower and less dramatic than wartime work, but he found it more satisfying. Building things was better than destroying them. Dr. Youngjia led the Galactic Research Initiative, a new organization dedicated to advancing scientific knowledge across all species. She worked to ensure that the galaxy's focus returned to creation rather than destruction. Her research teams made breakthroughs in medicine, energy production, and space exploration. The galaxy was building again instead of just maintaining. Admiral Daeho commanded the combined defense fleet from his flagship. He led joint exercises with ships from dozens of species, building the military capacity that would keep the peace. He took no pleasure in the work but understood its necessity. Peace without the means to defend it was just weakness waiting to be exploited. Ambassador Jiwoo served as the first Secretary General of the reformed Galactic Union. She had been elected by overwhelming majority, supported by species who appreciated her integrity and her efforts to build understanding during the war. She worked tirelessly to strengthen the new system and promote cooperation among the galaxy's diverse civilizations. She often thought about the cost of the changes that had been achieved. Millions had died. Civilizations had been shattered. The trauma of the war would echo through generations. But the system that had allowed such tragedies to occur had been replaced by something better. The price had been terrible, but it had purchased lasting change. Admiral Hyun Sik retired from military service shortly after the new union was established. He spent his final years writing a comprehensive history of the war, documenting everything that had happened and the lessons that had been learned.